The morning I buried my wife of 41 years, I told myself the worst was already over. I was wrong. I remember standing at the kitchen sink the following Tuesday, staring at a half-empty coffee mug I didn't remember filling. The house felt different without Carol in it. Not just quiet, hollowed out, like someone had reached in and removed the load-bearing walls, and I was just waiting for the ceiling to come down. I'd been married to that woman since I was 26 years old. I didn't know how to exist in rooms she used to occupy. My son had been calling every day since the funeral. My daughter-in-law, too. They'd been kind, attentive, the kind of present that feels like a hand on your shoulder. My son would stop by after work, eat dinner at my table, help me sort through Carol's medications, and cancel her subscriptions. My daughter-in-law brought casseroles twice a week and sat with me while I talked about nothing. I was grateful. I told myself I was lucky to have them. I was 67 years old, recently retired from 32 years as a structural engineer, and I had just lost the only person who had ever really known me. I was grieving. I was not paying close enough attention. The call came on a Thursday. I didn't recognize the number, but I answered anyway because in those weeks after Carol died, I answered everything. I was afraid of missing something important, afraid of becoming the kind of old man who lets the world pass by while he sits alone in a kitchen that smells like someone else's life. "Is this Walter?" The voice was a woman's. Professional. Careful in a way that made me straighten up. I said yes. "My name is Patricia Holt. I'm a licensed real estate agent with Cornerstone Properties. I have your listing for 4417 Birchwood Drive." I set the coffee mug down. That's right. There was a pause. The kind of pause that has weight to it. "Mr. Walter, I need you to come into my office. There's something I need to show you in person." Another pause. "And I need to ask you, please don't mention this conversation to your son before we meet." I stood very still. "Why not?" I asked. She didn't answer that directly. She just said, "Please, come tomorrow, 10 o'clock. And then she gave me her office address and hung up. I held the phone against my chest for a long time after that. Outside, a neighbor was mowing his lawn. The sound was so ordinary it almost made me angry. Let me back up. 4 months before Carol died, we had made a decision together. We'd been talking about it for years, selling the house we'd raised our son in. The house with the leaky garage roof and the garden Carol couldn't tend anymore, and buying something smaller, something easier. We wanted to be closer to our son and his wife. We thought that's what you did. You got older and you moved toward your family. Carol was the one who first said maybe we should talk to our son about it. Maybe he could help us find something in his neighborhood. He'd been asking us for years to come live nearby. Said he wanted to take care of us. Said he wanted his kids to grow up knowing their grandparents. We didn't have grandchildren yet, but we had hope. So we told our son what we were planning. He was enthusiastic in the way that should have been a comfort, but somehow wasn't. He offered to help with everything. The listing, the showings, the paperwork. He said his wife knew a real estate agent they trusted. He said we didn't need to worry about a thing. Carol died before we found a buyer. Pancreatic cancer, 6 weeks from diagnosis to the end. She went faster than either of us understood was possible. I was still in shock when my son gently reminded me, 2 weeks after her funeral, that the house was already listed, that there were 2 interested buyers, that the process was moving forward. He said it would be good for me to have something to focus on. He said staying in that house alone wasn't healthy. He said a lot of things that made sense individually but felt taken together, like a tide pulling me somewhere I hadn't decided to go. I signed the papers he brought me. I should tell you that now, because it matters. I signed things without reading them as carefully as I should have. I was a man who had spent his career reading structural documents with precision, and in the worst weeks of my grief, I signed papers at my kitchen table while my son explained them in summary, and I nodded and put pen to paper. I trusted him. He was my son. So when Patricia Holt told me not to tell him we were meeting, something cold moved through me. Her office was a 20-minute drive from my house. Small, clean, 2 plants by the window that looked like they got regular attention. She stood up when I came in and shook my hand, and there was something in her expression that I recognized. The look of someone who has been rehearsing a difficult conversation and still isn't sure how to begin. She gestured for me to sit. She sat across from me and folded her hands on the desk. "First," she said, "I want to say I'm very sorry about your wife." I thanked her. I've been doing this for 19 years, she said. I've seen a lot of transactions, a lot of families, a lot of situations. What I'm about to show you, I want you to know, I didn't come to this lightly. I went back and forth for 2 weeks. But I have a father your age, and I kept thinking about him. She opened a folder on her desk and turned it so I could read it. It took me a moment to understand what I was looking at. It was a power of attorney document. My name at the top, my signature at the bottom, authorizing my son to act on my behalf in all financial and real estate matters, including the right to receive, deposit, and transfer proceeds from the sale of my property at 4417 Birchwood Drive. I had never signed that document. I looked up at Patricia. She was watching me with an expression that was both careful and sad. When did this come through? I asked. 3 weeks ago. Your son submitted it when he came in to update the closing arrangements. She paused. The signature is very close to yours. But I've been working with your file since before your wife passed. I had your signature on the original listing agreement. I looked at them side by side. She laid 2 documents in front of me, my real signature and the one on the power of attorney. I stared at them. The forged one was good. It was better than good. Someone had spent time on it. The closing is scheduled for next Friday, she said quietly. The proceeds, just under $410,000, were set to be deposited into an account listed in your name. But the account number on file isn't one I've seen you provide. I ran it when I was double-checking the wire instructions. She slid another page toward me. The account is in your son's name. I sat in that chair, and I felt something happen inside me that I can only describe as a rearrangement. Not collapse, not panic, something quieter and more permanent. Like a foundation settling into a crack it had been hiding for years. I drove home, and I sat in Carol's garden for a long time. She had planted lavender along the back fence because she read somewhere that it kept the deer away. It didn't work, but she kept planting it anyway because she said she liked the way it looked in the late afternoon light. I sat in her garden, and I looked at her lavender, and I thought about all the things I did not know about my own son. I thought about the dinner 3 weeks ago when he'd asked me, casually, if I'd given any thought to what I'd do with the sale proceeds. I'd said I wasn't sure yet. He'd said there were some good investment options he'd been looking into. He'd said he wanted to make sure I was protected. I'd thought he was being thoughtful. I thought about the forms he'd brought to the house after Carol's funeral. How many were there? 4? 5? He'd explained each one briefly. Seller's disclosure updates. Authorization forms. I had signed them. I had been sitting in this same garden 2 hours after coming home from burying my wife, and I had signed papers at a patio table while my son said, "This one's just routine. Dad, this one just updates your contact information." Had the power of attorney been in that stack? Had I signed it without knowing what it was? I went back inside and I called a lawyer. Not a family friend, not someone my son had ever mentioned. I opened my laptop and I searched for an elder law attorney with good reviews, and I called the number, and I said, "I think someone may be stealing from me, and I think it may be my son." The lawyer's name was Conrad. David Conrad. He was calm on the phone in a way that felt practiced, like he'd heard this before, which I later learned he had. He told me not to sign anything else. He told me not to move any money. He told me not to confront my son or mention Patricia's name. He told me to come in the next morning and bring everything I had. I spent that evening going through every document I'd signed since Carol's diagnosis. I laid them all on the dining room table under the good light, the way I used to lay blueprints when I was checking someone else's work for errors. I have a habit, from my career, of looking for the thing that shouldn't be there, the load path that doesn't add up, the beam that's carrying more than it should. What I found in those documents was this. In addition to the power of attorney, there was an amendment to the listing agreement giving my son the right to receive and negotiate all offers on my behalf. There was a change of address form routing my banking correspondence to my son's house. And there was a document I didn't remember at all, a beneficiary update on a savings account Carol and I had held jointly for 20 years, redirecting the balance to my son upon any transfer or closure. I don't know if I had signed those documents without understanding what they were, or if some of them had been forged the way the power of attorney had been. Maybe both. By the time I sat down with David Conrad the next morning, I was no longer certain of anything I had put my name to in the previous 6 weeks. David was thorough. He reviewed everything I'd brought, asked me questions for 2 hours, and at the end, he said two things. The first was that what I had described constituted elder financial abuse and likely forgery, both of which were prosecutable offenses. The second was that I should call my daughter-in-law. I hadn't expected that. He explained his reasoning. In cases like this, he said, it was not uncommon for one spouse to be the architect and the other to be either a participant or, more often, a witness who had been put in an impossible position. The real estate agent called you, he said. That took courage. Someone close to this situation has a conscience. Find out if it's her. I thought about my daughter-in-law. I thought about the casseroles she'd brought, the way she'd sat with me and let me talk about Carol without trying to redirect the conversation. There had been something in her manner in those weeks, a tension I'd attributed to grief and the stress of having a mourning father-in-law in her orbit. I wondered now if it was something else. I called her from a gas station payphone, yes. There was still one, outside a station on Route 9, and I used it because David had told me to assume my cell phone had been checked. I dialed her work number, which I'd memorized years ago in case of emergency. She answered on the second ring. I said, "It's your father-in-law. I need you to listen to me very carefully, and I need you not to say my name out loud if anyone is nearby." There was a long silence, and then she said very quietly, "Okay." I said, "Do you know what your husband has done?" Another silence. Longer. Then she said, "I found the account statements 2 weeks ago. I've been trying to figure out what to do." I closed my eyes. I was standing at a gas station on a Tuesday afternoon, 67 years old, and I had just confirmed that the man my son had become was not someone I had raised on purpose. My daughter-in-law met with David Conrad 2 days later. She brought everything she had found, account records, wire transfer confirmations, text messages between my son and a financial advisor who had been helping him structure the transfers to avoid triggering bank alerts. She had been gathering it quietly, she said, because she was scared, because she didn't know who to go to, because my son had told her, more than once, that her name was on things too and she had better keep her mouth shut. That was the part that broke something open in me. He had used her as a shield. He had implicated her in something she hadn't agreed to and then held it over her head. She was 29 years old, and she had been trying to protect herself from my son while also, I think, trying to protect me, just not knowing how. The investigation moved quickly once we had her cooperation. Patricia Holt gave a formal statement. The bank flagged the account irregularities. A forensic document examiner confirmed that the power of attorney signature was not mine. My son had made the mistake of using a notary who had never actually met me, just notarized a document presented to her by my son as a formality. When they arrested him, it was on a Wednesday morning. I know because my daughter-in-law called me afterward, her voice shaking so hard I could barely understand her. She said they'd come to the house. She said he'd looked at her when they put the cuffs on like she was a stranger, like he'd never seen her before. I didn't go. I didn't want to watch. The charges were felony forgery, financial elder abuse, and wire fraud. The prosecutor told David that the case was strong. My son had been thorough but not thorough enough, the kind of careful that a person thinks is sufficient until someone with actual expertise looks at it. I had spent 32 years identifying structural failures in buildings that looked solid from the outside. There is a particular bitterness in recognizing your son as that kind of structure. He was sentenced to 9 years. His attorney negotiated it down from the original charges, citing my son's lack of prior criminal history and his cooperation in identifying the financial advisor who had helped him. 9 years. David told me that was actually a significant sentence for this type of case, that financial elder abuse convictions often resulted in lighter penalties, and that I should consider it a real outcome. I sat with that for a while. My daughter-in-law was not charged. The prosecutor determined that her involvement had been coerced, and that her cooperation had been material to the case. She divorced my son while he was awaiting sentencing. She showed up at my door the week the divorce was finalized, and we sat in Carol's garden for an hour without saying very much. Before she left, she told me she was sorry. I told her she had nothing to be sorry for. She shook her head like she disagreed. And maybe she did, and maybe that's something she'll have to work out for herself over time. The house sold. The proceeds went into my account, my actual account, the one I had opened fresh at a different bank, with David Conrad sitting beside me. $412,000. I bought a small place in a development 20 minutes from where my son used to live, which I understand is strange staying close to a place associated with pain, but I had friends nearby, and a church I'd been attending for 11 years, and a Tuesday morning coffee group of men my age who I was not willing to give up. I didn't move toward family in the end. I moved toward the life I'd built, the one that existed before and outside my son. That felt, in its own quiet way, like survival. There are things I think about. I think about the forms at the patio table, the papers I signed 2 hours after Carol's funeral while I was still wearing the clothes I'd worn to the cemetery. I've asked myself, more times than I can count, whether a smarter man would have caught it, whether a man who wasn't drowning in grief would have read each page before he signed it. I've had to make my peace with the fact that I was not at my most capable in those weeks. That grief is a vulnerability, and that my son knew exactly when to approach. I think about the fact that he had clearly been planning this before Carol died. The notary, the account structure, the amendment to the listing agreement. You don't put that together in the 2 weeks after a funeral. He had been watching our finances, our plans, our timeline, and he had decided something about what he was owed. I will spend the rest of my life not fully understanding where that came from. I think about Patricia Holt, who spent 2 weeks going back and forth before she made a phone call that changed my life. I have sent her a card every year since. She has never cashed the check I enclosed with the first one. I've stopped trying. I think about my daughter-in-law. She's building something new city, new job, new start at 29. We exchange texts sometimes. Nothing heavy, usually. She sent me a picture last spring of a garden she'd started at her apartment. A little pot of lavender on a balcony. I didn't tell her about Carol's lavender. Some things you hold. If you're older and someone in your family is helping you with your finances, there are things I wish someone had told me sooner. Never sign a document that's been summarized to you without reading it yourself, regardless of who is presenting it. A power of attorney is one of the most consequential things you can sign. It can authorize someone to act as you in matters you never intended. If you have an existing lawyer or financial advisor, any significant document should go through them before your signature is on it. If a family member becomes defensive or impatient when you say you want someone else to review something, that impatience is information. Note it. Take it seriously. And if someone calls you and asks you to come in quietly, without telling your family go, even if it feels like an overreaction, even if you're sure there's nothing wrong, the people who called me went out of their way when they had no obligation to. Patricia Holt had 19 years in real estate and had seen worse, and she still picked up the phone. That matters. When someone does that for you, take the meeting. I'm 68 now. I have a standing Tuesday coffee group in a house that fits me and a garden that's starting to look like something. I have a lawyer I trust and a bank account that only I can access and a new habit of reading every line of every document that comes across my table the way I should have been doing all along. Carol would have caught it. She was always sharper than I gave her credit for when it came to people. She had said something once, years ago, about our son that she worried about the way he related to money. I had brushed it off. I thought she was being a mother, overcritical the way mothers sometimes were. I think about that now. I think about it and I let it settle, and then I get up and I make coffee and I go about my day. That's all you can do, I think. You carry what's true, and you don't let the weight of it stop you from standing upright. You were built stronger than the people who tried to take advantage of your grief. And you don't owe anyone, not your children, not anyone, the right to decide what your life is worth or who controls it. You survived what they did to you. That's not nothing. That's everything.